evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. My name is Sonali Vanigambabage. Our topic of discussion tonight is, where is the equality for women of Sri Lanka? Where are we in this debate of women's rights, equality, feminism? Day in, day out, we hear of instances where countless women have been subjected to being battered, bruised, maimed, killed, raped, molested. And yet we read these newspapers, watch these TV programs, and we move on as though this were normal. So where are we really headed in terms of the law, in terms of policy, in terms of acceptance? As a society, where is Sri Lanka in this dialogue of ensuring that women are treated equally, equitably? So to discuss this, we have invited three guests to our studio. Very briefly, let me introduce them to you. We are joined by Dr. Bilesha Veeraratne. She's a research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies. Good evening and welcome, Doctor.
Thank you.
We are also joined by Jayanthi Kuru Utumpala. She's a women's rights activist and mountaineer. Thank you, Jayanthi, for being with us on Face the Nation. We look forward to hearing from you on the ways in which the role of women has changed for the better, and what the challenges are in this whole exercise. We're also joined by Amiza Teagle. She's an attorney at law. Good evening. This is your first time on our show.
Yes.
Good to have you, Amiza.
Thank you.
Very quickly, my first question I'd like to direct to Dr. Bilesha Veeraratne, Research Fellow, Institute of Policy Studies. Dr. Bilesha, issues faced by migrant workers, that's an area that you've done quite a bit of work in. We hear of so many instances where Sri Lanka's women travel to the Middle East under deplorable conditions and return to the country battered, bruised, maimed, raped. We've been having this dialogue about how migrant workers' rights are being violated continuously, yet we don't really do anything about it. There are the relevant stakeholders, however, they do nothing about it either. So I'd like to ask you, where does this end? And how do we need to hold to account the relevant stakeholders to ensure that this is brought to an end, or at least that the law is properly implemented?
I think there are two sides to the story. I think we might not be fair if we say stakeholders or the relevant authorities are not doing anything, because a lot has been done so far. I know previously there has been a lot of issues because not much was done, but lately there has been many efforts like pre-departure training for migrants, which has been compulsory. So all migrants who are, especially female domestic workers, they have to undergo this pre-departure training, which equips them to a great degree to face any problem or face any abuse or violation of their rights in a more methodical, systematic way. They have been taught how to handle it before things get too bad, so that to get out of a situation, and if things get bad, how to handle it. So there are so many things done, but I think one of the problems is that despite so many measures being taken, still a lot of people go outside the regulatory framework. So now normally a migrant has to go through the Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment and get registered, so that this ensures that they get the training, and then after they go to their destination country, that they are looked after if there is some problem. But if you do not go through the Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment, and let's say some people just take a visit visa and go to a destination country, and then through their contacts they change it to a work visa, or just overstay the visit visa and continue to work at the destination. So these people, they have not got the training, they have not got the proper understanding of how to handle situations at the destination country. So therefore they are very vulnerable. So partly it's their fault, partly it's the regulators, because if they have given a better understanding for the normal Sri Lankan people about problems, if they go outside of the regulatory framework, they might not have made that decision. So that's why I said there's two sides to the story. So that's the right way of doing things and a wrong way of doing things. And if people make the choice to do it the wrong way, then there are greater difficulties to be faced. But still, I think the embassies of our country still assist people when they are in distress in the destination countries. So a lot is being done, I think.
Right. Doctor, what about the lacunas in the system? And how do we go about rectifying those? Because we only know too well of the instances where women go overseas for employment and they return completely battered, bruised. I'm not talking about 100% of the cases, but it is a significantly disturbing number of cases that are reported, and these are only the cases that are reported to the media. There are thousands go unreported as well. So there is clearly an issue which needs to be recognized.
I think one area that can be improved is where people go through these outside channels, and there are some networks that is helping people to go outside these channels. So if there are better ways to handle these networks, and sometimes I've heard, not that I can prove it, that there are agents and there are maybe customs and immigration officials also involved. I don't know, I don't have proof for this, but this is what I've heard. So if there are better ways to monitor all these systems that involve in migration, I think we can come to a better solution, and as you said, that we can address some of the lacunas.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Bilesha Veeraratna. She's a research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies in Sri Lanka. I'd like to move my attention to Jayanthi Kuru Utumpala. Jayanthi, you stunned Sri Lanka through your feat. It's phenomenal, unprecedented, and I'm sure you've heard all the positive feedback from across the board. My question to you is, you are also a motivational speaker. You speak to children at schools, and in a bid to inspire them. I'd like to talk to you about gender stereotyping. Young girls are sometimes taught to be sweet and pretty, and I mean, we've heard of the saying, little girls are meant to be like sugar and spice and everything nice. So even in our local curriculum, we say amma battu yanawa, tatta vedata yanawa. This kind of stereotyping of genders. Yeah. So we see how the female child is from a very young age stunted. The growth is stunted. Don't climb trees, or don't get into fights. How does Sri Lanka go about challenging these stereotypes?
Thank you for the question, Sonali, and first of all, thank you for having me on the program. I think I firmly believe that actually education is one way that we need to move forward on this topic, because actually these stereotypes and the home also is a space where these stereotypes are nurtured and they sort of are fed into children from a very young age. In fact, even before babies are born, what are the colors we buy for them, right? If it's a boy, you have the entire baby room or the nursery with everything in blue. Now, why don't we use pink instead, or green, or yellow? There are so many colors in the rainbow, right? So this baby is born, has no clue about what gender is or about that baby's its role in life. But we start putting all these social sort of norms, the stereotypes, that if it's a boy, that baby is going to have a ball, then it grows up, there's guns, the kind of toys a child has. If it's a girl, you give them dolls to play with, dolls, so that you're feeding and nurturing these children. So one day you will become a mother, and you may not have the chance or the choice not to become a mother. But that's where the stereotypes begin. And I would like to actually share two examples. I never imagined I would be a motivational speaker after climbing Everest, because that wasn't the plan. Everest was a plan. Anyway, I've actually been inspired even more after coming back and sharing this story, particularly after speaking to school children. Actually, both Johan and I have been doing lots of just sharing our story about climbing Everest. but also all the lessons we learned in the process, life lessons, right? Not just climbing the mountain, but about mental strength and challenging gender stereotypes.
Absolutely.
And just one example is we were speaking at a school in a very rural, a small government school in Vennapur, and after we finished our katawa, after we finished our speech, all the boys ran to Johan, and some of the girls ran up to me.
Yeah.
It was a mixed school. But there were these 5 girls who told me something really interesting. They said, "Miss, we're so happy," I'll say it in English, but they said it in Sinhalese. They said, "We're so happy that you have climbed Everest first." And they said, "Because you have shown that girls can also come first." And then I said, "Well, of course girls can come first. Boys can also come first. Anyone can come first if you work hard, train hard, and society also needs to give girls that space for equality, then you can come first as well." And then these girls told me, "No, miss, our sports teacher, who is this fellow man standing over there, he says that boys are always first and girls are second." So now imagine what it does. These girls who are 12 years old, 11, 12, 13, what does it do to their mental state? They're going to constantly believe that they're never good enough, they're never strong enough. But these are the stereotypes, and I always believe that I was fortunate to have parents who gave me the space to do rock climbing, climb all the trees in the garden, including the coconut trees. And I think I didn't have those stereotypes at home in that sense. I was encouraged to go out and explore. So it's also our parents' responsibility in that sense to allow our girls and our boys to pursue their dreams in terms of if a boy wants to do ballet or dancing or singing, that's okay, because you would always be good at what if you're passionate about something, you'll always be good at that. So I think education, but also socializing at home is important to make sure that we challenge these stereotypes.
Thank you very much, Jayanti. Finally, my question to Urmiza Teagle, attorney at law. Urmiza, you've worked as a human rights lawyer for a long period of time. Recently, you've done quite a bit of work on the abortion law reform in Sri Lanka. Could you give us a brief on where it stands right now? What does the law say at present, and what do the reforms try to do?
Thank you, Sonali. I wouldn't say that I've done quite a bit of work. I have joined the conversation or the advocacy on this issue fairly recently. And it has been a long time in public consciousness, public debate, the law reform on abortion law. Where it is at the moment is that last year there were proposals to put to Cabinet an amendment to the Penal Code asking for abortion to be permitted on 2 grounds. One is on rape, and the other being for fetal abnormalities, which for these 2 reasons the mother could then ask for an abortion, and there are several checks that were also built into the law where you have to get a doctor's permission, things like that. And that was the law that was proposed. There was a group of doctors that were behind the proposals because they themselves see what women go through, what they have to suffer when abortions are done, not in safe conditions. And they were the most loud advocates for this law. However, it has not been put into a process where it would be enacted into law. It has not been taken up by the Ministry of Justice as yet.
So at what stage is the...
it is simply a proposal.
Bill. Okay.
And that's where it is.
So the conversation continues with no action?
There is no action whatsoever currently. I think the proposals were met with stiff opposition from religious leaders at the time last year. And that was a
roundtable discussion consisting, I think, of 100% men, if I'm not mistaken.
You remember the picture that flooded social media?
Yeah, I do.
Where all of the religious leaders, mainly men, and the doctors were then presenting and explaining to them what the proposals were and what conditions actually make these proposals much needed at this time. It's a very limited amendment. It's a very limited change to the law. In terms of women's rights, much more can be asked for. But even these limited conditions where a woman would suffer from rape and wanted to have that option is not permitted to. And a woman who has been told by the doctors that her unborn child has a fetal abnormality and might not survive, has no option to terminate that pregnancy.
Right. We hope to be speaking about this topic more in detail during the course of tonight's conversation. Thank you very much, Miza, for that. Before opening the floor for questions from our journalists, Jayanti, one question to you. This concept of body shaming, catcalling, I mean, we're quite used to it in Sri Lanka. If you walk on the road and a bunch of guys say, "Ah, Nangi," you know, you don't really think too much of it. You just, it's so normalized. But they don't stop there. So how do we go about changing the culture? Does this require a paradigm shift in attitudes, in mindset? Should these be issues that we should be talking about? I mean, or should we talk about you know, other issues which are more pressing because we're so used to these conversations going on? Where does this debate begin, Jayanti, in your opinion?
Okay, that's a big question, but I'll try to answer it as per my experience. I mean, yes, sexual harassment, so also referred to as catcalling, etc., which the boys probably think, oh, it's just jokes, right? Like, it doesn't make it's not a big deal. And even sexist jokes, for example, that are passed on WhatsApp groups, there are so many in numerous numbers. All these do have an impact in society in terms of putting women down constantly on a daily basis, normalizing it. And it's important also, yes, to definitely talk about it, even sexual harassment, even if it's verbal abuse on the street, you know. And I think it's also important at the same time not to only tell the women to talk about it, but it's important to have that discussion with men and boys.
Absolutely.
Because as there's this well-known masculinities expert, he's a guy called Jackson Katz based in the US. He actually has a fantastic program on a TED Talk that he did, where he says, violence against women is actually a men's issue, right? It's not a women's issue. It's actually a men's issue, and it's quite an amazing speech to listen to, because he plots it and he says, as a man, he's saying this, that we need to talk to the boys and men about respecting women, about dignity for everyone, about treating everyone equally, equality for all. And that's again linked to the socialization process, because in schools, if we're not teaching our boys how to treat women, we know the amount of issues there are currently in schools with all these nude selfies being shared with young people. So again, awareness, education is important on comprehensive sexuality education. We can't sort of live under a rock. I love rocks, but anyway, we can't live under a rock forever. Underneath the rock, you can get on top of it and over it, but you can't live under a rock and imagine that these young people are not exploring their sexuality. Of course they are. So we need to then cater the education syllabus so that they are also aware, and talk about consent, again, with boys particularly. Because again, there are these jokes that say the girl says no, 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 she means yes. And that's nonsense. That's the stereotype. So we need to, everyone, I mean, all of us, men and women and boys and girls, we also need to challenge these norms. It's important to question and ask why. Where are they coming from? Who makes the rules and who decides? So I think definitely involving schoolboys in this discussion is particularly important through the education curricula or through other external individuals in order to address issues of sexual harassment, which also lead to far worse serious crimes as well. You know?
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Jayanti. Very quickly, let me introduce our two journalists this evening, Charita Fernando, as well as Charlene Benedict, joining us for the first time. Charlene, since it's your first day, let's start off with you.
Thank you very much, Sonali. I'd like to direct my first question to Jayanti Kurutumpala. You were speaking about awareness and all that. We do know that here in Sri Lanka, sexual education does not occupy, let's just say, a significant part of our education curriculum, and it's not possible, you know, to jump from square 1 to square 10. It's a progressive thing. You go to square 2, square 3. So speaking from where we are at now, do you think that there is at least sufficient sexual education to go about with, to speak of a change that could bring about difference, not only in schools here in Colombo? I believe schools here in Colombo do have a sufficient amount of sexual education in their curriculum, but moving towards the more rural side of Sri Lanka, I believe from the basic level there is very, very, very little education to go about with. So how do we work on coping? And you, of course, would have a lot of experience on this as a motivational speaker. Do you believe, are you satisfied with the level of sexual education that the children in rural areas possess?
Thanks for the question, and definitely not satisfied at all. I think there isn't, or it's almost non-existent if you look at sexual education or sexuality education. And yes, I mean, I'm not suggesting that you jump from 0 to 100, but again, if you start talking about issues of equality, and that simply means you're a boy and you're a girl, but you all are equal. What's the difference? It's a biological difference only. Everything else that's attached to you as a boy that says you're strong, that you can do sports, that you can drive a car and drive a bus, a girl can also do, right? It doesn't matter. I mean, the sexual organs are different. So I'm saying you can have it a very simple thing to talk about equality, and from equality you can build an argument to say if everyone is equal, you respect everyone in the same way. If you are given an opportunity to have, like I know in some communities, maybe in Colombo also, where they might give the bigger piece of chicken to the boy, or because he's growing man, he needs to grow. But that's unequal, you know. That's where I would say, if you're giving an egg to the boy, give the egg to the girl. I know communities where, I mean, in the work that I've done, where, eka bitteryak tiyenne, one egg, so we'll have to give it to the boy, you know. And so then girls grow up, again, nutrition. There's less nutrition to the girls, so this all leads to then in terms of your fitness levels. Why are girls not able to run as fast? Because they're not encouraged to do that. During the tsunami, more women actually died in the tsunami, or there were more women affected by it, because who was able to climb all the trees? The boys. Who ran the fastest? The boys. Because of the training from a young age, right? Girls are allowed to do that from puberty at that age, but beyond puberty, now you have to behave like a girl. So where are these ideas coming from? I think it's important for us to keep questioning that. And even sexuality education, just to come back to your question, if you start talking about equality and respect for diversity, whether you have green hair, blue hair, or curly hair, or brown eyes, it doesn't matter. We are all equal human beings. We all feel pain, we all feel love, we all feel hunger, right? We may be from different backgrounds, etc., different religions, ethnicities, caste, gender, everything, but we are also human. And that's the foundation, sort of, in a sense, that for at least younger children, and you build it up from that point onwards, talking about consent, awareness, contraception, your body, your right to your own body to make decisions about it. And it can, so there's also, when you say sexuality education, there's a globally accepted term called comprehensive sexuality education. So the UN is proposing that. And that means also age appropriate. So for 3-year-olds or 5-year-olds, you have age appropriate education that takes into account their age and what they can understand. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Jayanti, you said, you asked, where do these ideas come from? They seem to be coming through generations. I mean, for example, back while I was in school, we had a teacher who taught us health and physical education. And for the lesson on sexual education, we were sent a separate male teacher, because the female teacher didn't feel comfortable enough to speak with boys about sexual education. This seems to be a stigma that is coming from generation to generation, and there comes a point where we must say enough is enough and cut the chain from continuing, don't you think?
Absolutely, definitely, I agree with you on that. It's time to change. I mean, that's again, I would also pin it back to colonial times. When we talk about our culture of not talking about this, if you go think about the times before colonization. So we've also got this whole Victorian morality, you know, where the woman should be in the domestic sphere in the home, the man should go out to work. Those stereotypes, a lot of them came with colonization, British colonization. But before colonization, we had, you know, cohabiting partners, marriage laws didn't exist. There was so much more diversity in the societies. So that's also interesting to think about. When we say culture, whose culture are we talking about? And as you say, so generations, yes, have now gone through colonization and we are still struggling with it. But that's why it's important to think about our culture as something that goes actually, not British culture that we are holding on to, but actually a culture of, when we talk about, as whatever religion, we have 4 religions, main religions in our country, what do they all teach about? They all talk about respect. In fact, Buddhism, women have played key roles if you look at, the history of Buddhism itself. So that's also important to bring into the consciousness raising, awareness raising discussion on that.
Misa, I was reading an article based on a report by UNFPA, jointly done by UNFPA and the University of California. So it is on unnatural deaths of Sri Lankan women. There are some startling revelations. It says 36% of homicides of women were caused by husbands, partners or boyfriends, and 21% by blood relatives. What does this tell you about Sri Lankan society? Is this a trend, or has this been there since, is it a new trend that we are seeing, or has it been there? Has it been the case?
I don't think it's a new trend. I think there is a high level of violence that women do experience in the country. Just from, and I wonder whether the work that I do, coming into contact with victims of violence, would make me say this. But it feels like when we read the newspapers, today's news, there is so much violence directed at women, and that is something that they face on a day-to-day basis. I think I'm amazed at how much women have also internalized, how late they come to the law, how late they come to telling someone about the violence that they face. All kinds of excuses are given before they break that silence, and it's always almost as a last resort that they decide to speak about it. These numbers are startling, but it is true, and it has been around, and it's something that we need to take note of now and fairly fast, because I feel institutions, politicians, people in decision-making positions don't really understand and are not responding in a way that demonstrates shock, and is not responding in a way that says this ought to stop now.
So does it mean to say that if you look at the South Asian region, that we are one of the countries that has the highest rate for sexual violence against women, because it's also there in a report that we are high up there?
I'm not too familiar with comparisons in South Asia itself, but looking at the numbers that are coming out of Sri Lanka itself, I would say that there is a problem that needs to be recognized, and it's quite damning that we have not recognized it. There are definitely things happening. This is a space that I've seen in the last couple of years where there has been movement, and there has also been a space for women to talk about issues that face them. It's taking time. As I said, it's a silence that is not easily broken. So we are seeing a slow progress, a slow voicing of these issues, whether it be whether it's the abortion law, whether it's a quota for women in representation, whether it's and that was something that was successful at the local government level. Whether it's women asking for their rights under the Muslim Women and Divorce Act, whether it's divorce law in this country. There is a range of topics on which women are raising their voices today, and I think that's heartening to see, but it's also frustrating to see that there is no response, or the response is slow.
Jayanti, yes, at some instances, women itself, like say for example grandmothers or aunties, sometimes prevent a victim from making it public, or going to the police and getting help because of the stigma. Is this changing, or is this also a big challenge that's still in the country?
I think it might be changing more with the younger generation, who are more aware actually about feminism, women's rights. There's more discussion happening sort of in public spaces or in schools. But with the older generation, that is there, where women are the ones who actually might say, yes, we shouldn't talk about it. But I don't like to blame women, because what I believe in is also that if you look at the society we are living in, which is male-dominated, the women are the ones who have the bigger responsibility to make sure that those patriarchal norms are established in society, in the family, at home. And it's like, if you don't do that, then you're not doing your role as a wife, as a woman, as a mother, right, as a daughter. So, for example, just to give an example, if, for example, a couple has a child and the child goes astray, say at 18 the child is doing drugs, say it's a boy, whatever, or a girl doing drugs and horrible things like that, who gets blamed? It's always the mother's fault, right? It's like, oh, you're the one, you didn't raise this child properly. So there's more blame on the woman if those norms are not kept in place. So I also feel that women are not born on another planet, right? So they're also born on this planet where patriarchy is existing, and it's harder for them, therefore they become the ones who have to uphold these norms even more, because that's what society has been feeding into them, and that's what Hermes are referred to as internalization, where you're born believing that, oh my gosh, I'm born to become a mother with a baby, that's why I'm given a doll. I'm born to be in the house, in the kitchen, and cook. I'm born to eat less food and make sure that the boys eat more, my brother or my father. I'm born to keep serving them and make sure they eat before me. You know, so you keep doing that, and if it's a socialization process that becomes so normal that you don't question it. You stop questioning. You go to school, what do we learn in school? Like the textbooks that you mentioned earlier. The woman is sweeping the house or cooking, and the father is going out to work, right? And if children actually say, I've heard a case where someone's child actually said, because the question is, what does your mother do and what does your father do? And this child had actually put down saying, my mother goes to work, my father goes to work. And she had got a 0 for that, because that's not the correct answer. The textbook says, mother stays at home, father cooks, father goes to work. But that's not her reality. And it's not the reality for many children, many women in the country. So it's in that sense unfortunate that, yes, women are the ones who will make sure that these norms exist, but I feel that's because of the way society has also socialized them and conditioned. But despite that, there are so many grandmothers I know also, and women who are like in my mother's generation, let's say, older than I am, who are actually speaking out. And now I think more and more also with more awareness, not just the younger generation in that sense, there are a few more women at least talking. But that might also be more in Colombo and not so much in rural areas as well. Yeah.
Belisha, with the type of work that you've done with migrant women, do you think if there were more women involved in policy making and regulating women who are going overseas, especially to the Middle East for work, whether this process could be streamlined and to make sure that things happen according to a system? Because we see now, we had a minister, a female minister in charge of and then suddenly that person is moved and somebody else is appointed. If there are more women dealing with or looking into these issues, do you think that would make a difference?
I think it would make a difference, because a woman would look at it from the point of view of a woman. For a male, he has to understand what's going on, so that might be hard. Sometimes they don't understand the full gravity of it or the full emotional context of it. So in that sense, some efforts have been done where these grievance hearings have to be also represented by females for these migrants' grievance cases. But a lot more can be done, as you said, because especially in the diplomatic missions, often there aren't sufficient females to handle migrant workers' cases, female migrant workers' cases at destination countries. So sometimes they might not be free to come up and tell a strange male official what exactly happened or what is the difficulty. So if there were more females, even if there weren't enough females, if there was proper gender sensitization for the officials and they knew to handle things in a more gender neutral way, females would be more comfortable to approach them, and that might improve the system.
Do you think...
I'd like to draw your attention to this point of gender sensitization that Dr. Bilesha mentioned. In our justice system, when it comes to rape, child abuse, we see the manner in which victims are continuously victimized as a result of the justice process itself. Can you take us through some of the horrific instances that young children who are aged 15, 16, 17, who are raped but then have to retell their story countless numbers of time until they are well into their 30s sometimes. How do we rectify this?
The situation is that the system is not sensitive to women and children and the particularities of those cases. The system treats all cases the same, and the way in which it does that is to require the story to be told. I think even if you're a man in this system and you have a very straightforward case, it doesn't even have to be rape. It takes you through a long process.
Sure. And
it frustrates, it tires any litigant that goes into the process. And these are things that are being looked into. Law reform on laws delays, things that are being looked into now. But it's a long time coming. But with women and children in particular, there have to be large changes. There have to be big changes that need to be made. For example, something I often speak about is the fact that where there has been, let's say, a rape of a child, and I'm speaking from the experience of certain cases, once the suspect has been identified, they sometimes have an identification parade for the victim to identify the suspect. And the way in which it often happens is that the child is asked to stand in front of a row of men and point out this individual. So there is no physical barrier. There is nothing to shield this child from this experience of having to point this person out. Although the law does provide for identification from a place of hiding, there are no structures in place. There is no explicit language which says children, women, and again I say even men, that they should not experience this. You should not have to meet your perpetrator in a lineup where you say sometimes your name and address for even unknown persons to hear.
Sure.
And I've had women older than, that means not children, who have been finding it very difficult to go through this experience. And children who have, and a child who has cried and said, I don't want to do this. And still the system requires that you identify, which is fine. But then you need to make, it's not victim friendly. You need to make all possible measures, take all possible measures to ensure that this victim is safe, secure, and as you said, not re-victimize over and over again because she or this child wants to pursue justice.
Miza, this conversation about law reform, about laws delays and rectifying it has been going on for years. However, nothing substantial has been done in some of the key areas such as what we just spoke about. So in your opinion, how do we go about doing this?
I think there has to be a commitment to larger reforms. There have been things that have been done. I don't think it's fair to say that things have not happened. For example, with the National Child Protection Authority and the video recording of evidence that they have taken, I think that's a great step forward with children. Similarly, there have been other things that have been done, but when you look at it holistically, when you look at it as a total, you do feel the system is failing so many people. And therefore, there has to be large structural changes. It cannot be these individual ad hoc changes that happen. And for that, there has to be great political commitment and will. And that requires people to agree on the way forward. And I think there are lots of other battles that seem to occupy political space, that the everyday needs of, and seeking justice is an everyday need, is by the wayside. It does not get the kind of attention and priority that it needs.
Thank you very much. We hope the relevant stakeholders are also watching this show and that they are making notes. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back. Good evening. Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. We're discussing how we can build a safe and equal Sri Lanka for Sri Lanka's women. My first question in this round is to Amiza. Amiza, let's talk a bit about rape culture. Kurt Cobain has said the problem with groups who deal with rape is that they try to educate women about how to defend themselves. What really needs to be done is teaching men not to rape. Go to the source and start there. How accurate is that statement, and how do we go about effecting this through the school level, at school level?
So I think this ties in very much with what Jayanti was speaking about.
Sure.
Before. It is very much a men's problem, a men's issue as well. And I think we don't have these conversations about sexuality, about consent at a very early age. Also, this conversations about respecting your body, understanding yourself, the issue of body shaming, all of that. It's not even taboo. People don't want to talk about it, or it's spoken about in a very negative way. So I think having those conversations at home, in schools, is extremely important. The fact that we have also separate, like we have boys' schools and girls' schools, and there is no interaction, there is no space to understand the other sex, the other genders, then how are we supposed to understand, how are we supposed to develop our own ideas and attitudes and have an open conversation about these things?
So Amiza, I mean, if we take a city, usually we get about 5-6 massage parlors, so-called massage parlors or spas. I mean, within every kilometer you get a spa. So, I mean, this culture of being sort of conventional or being very traditional minded just goes to the wind. I mean, Sri Lanka is known to have the highest statistic for searching the word sex on Google. So, I mean, it's a bunch of contradictions. In terms of, again, I want to tie this up with education reforms. How do we go about this process? Because I think even the stakeholders, I mean, we look at 225 parliamentarians. First, the parliamentarians need to be able to have the capacity to comprehend. So if we were to perhaps assist them with this endeavor by, you know, looking at a better generation for tomorrow, how should we go about this?
I think it starts with parliamentarians. I think it needs to come from right from the top.
Sure.
The change, because institutions are so set in their ways, so set in their traditions, so set in these as protectors of a culture that is known only to them sometimes. It is important that leadership is given in these areas, and parliamentarians, I've heard this topic being discussed at by parliamentarians, and I think there are those who are interested in taking something forward, but the voices are few. And
the voices get muffled along the way.
They do, they certainly do. So there is no wide support for this kind of reform. But only if it comes at this stage from the very top, and there are leaders who will give a strong voice to changing education systems, to introducing these subjects, to saying that we need this change in response to all of the other problems that we spoke about, in response to the violence, in response to how we treat and what we think and what we expect of women in society. It is not only about sex education. It is not only about what children learn in school. It is about what kind of citizens they become and how they face life in the future. So it is extremely important that it is part of the education system. But at this stage, because the systems are so ingrained and it feels like they are fairly immovable, that a strong voice from the top, strong leadership on these issues is a must.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Bilesha, I'd like to come to you. Let's talk about the attitudes in law enforcement agencies. If I, as a woman, am abused and I go to the police station, do I have the guarantee that my rights will be protected, that I can tell my story without being ridiculed or without being told that I need to go back to my place of abuse and live amicably with my husband? These are issues faced by every other woman who is abused. They are most of the time told to go back to the perpetrator. And this is also most of the time directly linked to the fact that most women are economically dependent on their husbands or boyfriends. So it's a vicious cycle, really. Because once they're in that mess, they can't go back to their parents because it's a stigmatization of that whole marriage breakdown. So, as an expert in this field, how do you look at it, and how do we end this vicious cycle?
I think you were very correct that people might not have confidence in the system to go and make a complaint if they are in trouble, because they might get into more trouble. So I can bring out one example from migration, which is my area of expertise. When you ask why women migrate, the main reasons are financial reasons, to collect money to build a house or to collect money to give the daughter in marriage or something. And another reason that comes out very strongly is to escape violence, domestic violence, to escape a husband who is drinking and coming home and abusing her at night. So migration has become a very convenient way where they don't have to divorce the husband or leave him permanently, but it's like an escape mechanism, a temporary escape mechanism where you can leave the family back here, go away and earn money and still help the family. So in that sense, migration is helping some women who are experiencing difficulties at home. But again, the system has created another little bit of an issue with this family background report, you might know, where women who are migrating have to get this family background report filled up by the development officers in that region. So the rules as per the family background report is that if you have a child less than 5 years old, females cannot migrate. If you have children over 5 years of age, you can migrate for employment, provided you can show that there is reasonable care arrangements for the children left at home. And one of the clauses of this family background report is that you have to get your husband's signature. So now sometimes the woman might be separated from the husband or it's divorced, and if it is not a proper divorce but they have just, living apart, it's very difficult for these females to go and prove themselves to these DOs to fill up this form. They say, if you don't have a divorce certificate, you have to get your husband's signature. So, but they are not in good terms. The husband might not sign it. And she's like, this is a vicious cycle that they experience. So there are certain things going on, and some changes were tried to change the family background report, but it has not been fully successful. Some changes have been done.
Dr. Bilesha, may I ask you, with regard to these specific issues that you brought out, were there any attempts made to bring this to the attention of the authorities?
There was many attempts. As far as I know, there was a cabinet subcommittee appointed to look into this family background report, and there was a lot of voice and support to revise this or abolish this, but it didn't have enough meat or enough support from the stakeholders, relevant stakeholders, so it continues, but there are some revisions made now.
Right.
So now it's not as bad as it was, but
Right.
still, in my personal belief, there is still more scope to improve this family background report.
Right. So the attention of the authorities has once again not been given to this crucial issue.
Not sufficient. It's been
Not
given,
sufficient.
but it's not
Right.
sufficient.
Thank you very much. Jayanti, let's also talk about positive role models in society. I mean, we also find instances where there are fantastic positive male role models. When you mentioned the story of the egg being given to the boy child, I mean, during the break I was just telling you, when I was small I used to get the egg.
Yes.
So I mean, in this whole society, there have been some fantastic male role models, and they have also steered this conversation of feminism, equality for women as well. Let's talk a bit about them as well, and how important it is for men to join in this conversation, because women's rights is not an issue that only impacts women. Men need to get involved in the conversation more. So, because there's also on the other end of the spectrum, the moment you speak about women's rights, you're called a feminazi, you know, or you think it's a woman who hates men, doesn't shave her legs, you know, that whole extreme radical feminism aspect is sort of given to it. So how do we balance this whole conversation?
Thanks for the question, Sonali. I agree with you that definitely we need to have, I mean, we do have our society, our community. In Sri Lanka, at least, we have many male role models. Like if you think about the cricketers, so one name that promptly comes to mind is Kumar Sangakkara, of course, and I have heard him speak, and now that I've climbed Everest, I've been able to actually have one-on-one chats with him as well, just being in the same space. But I think he's like an ideal example of someone who's able to talk about this issue. And it is important also, I think, for activists, for civil society, to pull out, you know, to reach out to them, because he also has a large audience, you know. But it's important, it's also a fine line, because there's also something called mansplaining, which Kumar Sangakkara doesn't do. But there are sometimes in this whole campaign of working with men and boys, now this, if you think about this campaign called He for She, when that came out, which began by the UN a couple of years ago, there was a lot of criticism by the women's rights activists. Why? Because it almost felt like he is now doing this for her. It's almost like, oh, I will give this gift to you. But it's not something he has to give. It's something that, as another feminist in India said, it should actually be he for himself and for other men. Right? Because if men talk to other men and say, like for example, if you're going in the bus and you're a man, and every day I have been this, I used to travel by bus pretty much all my life until I was about 23. If you go in the bus and you see a woman being harassed, Jack Kahanwa, we know every single day, rush hour, it happens. So schoolgirls, whatever the age, whatever you're wearing, if you see another man doing this, step in, stop that. You can do that, because all you have to do is move, push that person away. That fellow is not going to do anything to you. But if the girl actually speaks up, unfortunately, what happens is then the conductor says, if you can't go in the bus, you go in your Mercedes Benz. Or everyone starts staring at her like she's done the worst thing on the planet. But that's where it's important for men to talk to other men and say, that they don't have to talk to women and say, oh, we will treat you nicely and we are giving you all this equality on a platter. But it's talk to other men and say, Machang, stop this, men don't whistle at girls, stop sending those sexist videos, stop sending those sexist jokes around. It's not right, women are equal. That's important, and I think someone like Kumar Sangakkara has been, from the speeches I've heard him give, has been able to convey that kind of message. And Mahela Jayawardene as well, in fact, they've had quite a few programs to school children, sort of saying, you know, what is this? Why do we treat our women in ways that are not equal, without respect? and that's important. So it is important to really work with people who believe in that concept in a way that also treats women equally, but also understand that your target audience is also other men really, and young boys particularly, and just to say, you know, stop, just stop. We can treat people equally. Yeah.
Right. Following up from that conversation, Urmiza, now Jayanti spoke about the manner in which multiple stakeholders have a role to play in this whole debate, in this conversation. How do we converge or bring to one place this conversation, where we have the policymakers on the one hand, we have civil society, we have citizenry and all the stakeholders, where we effect proper sustainable mechanisms in terms of law or education reforms, because conversations are happening in isolated places, but at the end of the day there's no collated effort which is meaningful. So how do we go about doing that?
That's rather a tall question to answer. I think the reason that we feel that it's spread all over the conversation is happening everywhere is because what affects women affects all of us in society at very different levels, and it affects us everywhere. It is not something that is only in one place, whether it's education or within the court systems, or it happens on the road, in the house. It happens everywhere. And that conversation needs to be, that kind of sea change needs to happen everywhere. I think it's great that if there are ad hoc conversations happening. I know in terms of actually making structural, institutional changes, there need to be concerted, long-term efforts with proper prioritization and money being put behind it. Without the right kind of funding that even states can allocate to this kind of issue, it's not going to happen. So if we are talking about Domestic Violence Act being amended, we are also talking about putting aside the kind of state funds that are required to assist victims of domestic violence out of that situation. It's not good enough that we say that they can come to court and that they can get protection orders. How do they bring themselves out of that situation is something that should also concern the state. So I think in terms of institutional changes, making legal reforms or doing one-off sort of reformatory actions is not enough. And there you need concerted efforts that look at the realities, the lived realities of women, and address that in total. So it's not good enough to give a protection order. A judge gives a protection order, that woman victim takes that order, goes back home. There is no one standing outside her gate when the husband or the boyfriend or whoever it is that she says is harassing her comes to that place. The police come afterwards. So there must be safe houses, and that requires the kind of state funding and reaching out far more than what we think we see in terms of law reform, commitments on paper, speeches that are being made. So to put the kind of money where your mouth is really, and say this is that you're committed to making a change.
Right. Thank you very much for that message, mainly for our policymakers who are some of the main stakeholders in this enterprise. I'd like to open the floor for questions from our journalists. Charita, let's start off with you.
Thank you, Sonali. Yeah, I'd like to ask my next question from Amisa. Now, we know how slow state mechanisms move, right? And we have also seen some kind of resistance from educational authorities when someone comes up with an idea to introduce sexual education, bring it into the national curriculum, right? So given those challenges, do you think an informal awareness campaign would actually work in Sri Lanka? Because I've seen situations where, you know, when civil society gets involved, there's this perception that, oh, they're funded by NGOs, they're, you know, trying to brainwash our children, change perception. So then that kind of movement lacks credibility. especially in rural areas. So how do we get over this challenge?
I think the kind of conversations, I must admit that talking about bringing sex education to schools is not something that I've worked with but closely. It's something that I've only read about in the papers, heard about in conversation. It takes, I'm sorry, now I've forgotten the question.
I was wondering whether an informal...
Informal, yes. So I think it's important to have public debate. And several of these civil society organizations or NGOs do raise the particular instances. So we have one or two cases that get highlighted, they take up the cause, they may take up the case, and then that sometimes is criticized and there is backlash, right? But the public debate that sparks, and I think it's important to keep that public debate open, I think that makes a big difference to changing attitudes of the masses, talk about it openly. And hopefully that will also contribute. A part of education is having that public change, ideas of the public themselves change. One example that I can talk about more confidently is even over the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act reform. I think the fact that Muslim women are talking about issues of what the minimum age of marriage should be, that is an important thing to hear. And the fact that it has the space to do that, and maybe the first few attempts had been civil society-led, organization-led, and even though that gets discredited, and that's a natural thing where there is a backlash saying, oh, these are foreign ideas, I think you face that and you keep moving that conversation forward. Because I think as the conversation builds and as long as people start talking about it in their local, whether it's schools or playgrounds, and then it's in the media, and then you have a chat about it with your friends, that's important. That part of the informal advocacy is important.
Jayanti, quite often we see role models mostly from the Western province, affluent class. I'm just wondering whether that relates to situations in rural areas. Can't we get role models from the masses?
Well,
will it work? Will it relate better?
Yeah, Susantika Jayasinghe is from a tiny village. I mean, I was at an event recently where she spoke about her childhood, her early days, where they hardly had food in the house. So there, I think we do have role models from the rural areas as well. Particularly, I think sports people in that sense who've been able to come to the fore and represent Sri Lanka at an international level. And that, again, finding role models, I wish there was like a bank we could put them on into and then pull them out. I feel that we need to be able to, as a society, again, structures are important to be put into place where I definitely feel more female role models, more girls or women, we need far more, definitely. But the lack of it also, in a sense, is because the structures in society don't allow or don't give women the equal space. Right. Just another example to give you is this. Again, once I had shared one of these, the story about climbing Everest, had done a motivational speech, and this other girl came up to me and said, and she must have been in her late 20s, but she was from, not from Colombo, from another place out of Colombo, now working as a management trainee in Colombo at a private company. And she said, you've inspired me now to follow my dream. And I asked her, what is your dream? And she said, my dream is to learn to play the guitar. And I really thought, okay, that's something quite doable. But she said how hard it was for her, because she said her peers, her friends would tease her and say, why are you playing the guitar? That's for boys. You should be playing the violin. So in a sense, and that's ridiculous when you think about it. Why? If you have a passion for something and you want to do something, we need to allow people to do that. So, but in that peer circle of friends she had, it was again seen as, oh, this is a boy's instrument and that's a girl's instrument, right? So where does she get that opportunity then for equal access to something, to do something that she wants to do? So again, if through education, through state structures, through the law, we need to ensure that there is equality for all, so that women are also able to enjoy those opportunities in a way that then they can come up to a place to be role models. I mean, I can't even imagine how many Sri Lankan female cricketers there are who probably want far more to go further, but we know the numbers, the money that goes into men's cricket and women's cricket. Now I think for the first time they are playing T20 matches for women's cricket in schools. First time in how many years in the century of in the history of Sri Lanka, but and how much is it covered in the media? You know, so it's also in terms of how do we create, there are so many amazing cricketers we've got in the women's team. It might also mean that we really focus, the media can do a lot in that also, give some focus, get their stories. I know the media has been doing more like featuring women in the media itself, women who've done amazing things and broken the glass ceiling, challenged stereotypes, but I think we need much more also. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Meeza, I'd like to shift this conversation to a more serious note, onto a discussion that has been prevalent in this country, the world over, for years on end. Rape. One point is that I've seen that some of the victims of rape or sexual harassment, they don't even know that they are being raped or sexually harassed. Harassed. You as an attorney at law would have encountered this countless amount of times. How bad is the situation here in Sri Lanka?
In speaking from my own experience with the cases that I handle and maybe the stories that I've heard from victims themselves, the situation is quite bad. The levels of violence are quite severe, and I'm amazed time and time and again at how much is endured by women in particular. So I would say that there's a lot to do and a long way to go to recognizing, even by the woman who is facing the violence herself, as to what's happening. I think our sense of self has degraded quite a bit for these victims, and that is something that we need to recognize. I
was looking at an article, a video a couple of days back that popped up on my social media feed. It said the rape culture in Haryana, it's a state in India. So while I was watching the video, I was just appalled by the state that to the grade at which women's rights were degraded in this state, because people in that state, they had one simple excuse for the rapes that were taking place. There was 10 rapes within 10 days in the state of Haryana consecutively, and that sparked quite an outrage in India. So their main point of argument was that the main person to blame is the victim. They blamed the victim. They blamed her clothes. They blamed the fact that she associated men. They blamed the fact that she was out at night. Do we have such a situation? Well, not in Colombo and areas like that, but in rural Sri Lanka. Another point was that the honor of a family always rests with the woman. The male can do whatever they want and get away with it or something like that. But the minute that a female is even the victim of a rape case, they've brought scorn and discourse to their family.
So
how is the state in Sri Lanka?
The state in Sri Lanka is not very different. There is quite a lot of victim blaming that happens, and I think it's good to talk about. Even though it is victim blaming, I rather that people talk about it and are open with their ideas so that can be then addressed and countered. There is quite a lot of victim blaming. I think, again, I've seen it being internalized by the victims themselves, who think about it in terms of blaming themselves, which again speaks to how much we are not addressing these issues or talking about it. And it also goes to the fact that we always place, like you said, this idea of honor, this idea of being good, purity. It's attached to the idea of woman and not at all to the idea of man. And I think this dichotomy is something that we need to question, because we don't only disadvantage women, we also disadvantage men by doing this. We don't talk about men. We always say, it's this thing about boys don't cry. But boys do cry, and they keep it in. And not allowing boys to cry is the injustice that we do to them. So not being able to explore the fullness of the humanity of every individual, of whatever emotion that I feel to be able to express that freely, to pursue my dreams and passions, as Jayanti was talking about. As an individual, I think we marginalize both what is woman and what is man in these conversations in society. So we blame women particularly because we expect these unreasonable standards from them. That, I think, has a lot to do with why there is so much victim blaming that happens.
Jayanti, you were speaking about men standing up for women. For example, you brought up the example in buses where women are being Jack Gahanama, you said. Do you believe that women should stand up for women as well? No, I mean, I'd agree completely with the point that even if a man does see these things happening in a bus, they'd rather prefer to keep their mouth shut because they just don't want to get into trouble. But what about the woman?
Of course.
They should stand up as well?
Absolutely, and I feel that's why what women's rights activists do, you know, standing up for other women.
But do they? But do they?
I believe so, yes, absolutely.
You've encountered incidents where they do?
Well, I mean, in terms of inspiring other people or talking about people's rights in the work we do. So I'm also talking from as a women's rights activist. That's been my sort of career in that sense. And with the women that I have been working with, I know that it's not a job as such. You can't be an activist. It's not your salary so much. It's more something you're passionate about. And for me personally, I got into this because I face sexual harassment traveling by bus, public transport. And because I know so many other people, when I would go into the office every single day, there was every other girl. You go into a room full of girls, you ask them, have you faced any kind of sexual violence in your life? Everyone's hands go up. Whether it's verbal abuse, to walking on the street, whether it's sexual harassment, whether it's rape, gang rape. You know, not everyone has faced gang rape and rape, but I'm saying verbal abuse, a variety of violence. So, and that's why I think people who do this kind of work, it's also because you believe that you can change the world. And it's important to also remember that there are people who change and society can change, because when you go back to the fact that these norms, we spoke about stereotypes earlier, they are made by society, right? So which is why I firmly believe that men should also step in, and women. Again, I'm saying I'm someone who believes in equality. So I'm not saying one shouldn't do it and the other one should do it, but I'm saying both parties, as in men and women, boys and girls, should work towards equality together.
Jayanti, on the sidelines of this conversation, this is not too much on the important side, but recently there was a debate sparked over a ban on purchasing alcohol. Some people called it unconstitutional. I'd just like to get your input on that.
Well, again, where is the law coming from? British colonial law, right? Just like our penal code, which is 1883, my God, like, I mean, think about it, 1883. And I'll go back to the serious topic of the rape law itself. Do you know that the law itself, which was drafted in 1883, so it's an archaic dinosaur kind of law, talks about rape only as peno-vaginal rape. We know so much rape happens to boys are raped. It's not spoken about. You don't have to be raped only by a penis, by male genitalia. There are multiple ways women are raped, right? But the law only looks at it in one way, and that's archaic, right? So just like that, this alcohol ban is again something that Victorian England decided, right? Oh, that women, it's not proper for women to go and buy alcohol because a man should buy it for them. Again, but that's talking about, I mean, I'm completely against that ban. It's ridiculous, I think. And it's ridiculous that it's come back now, but that's my opinion.
So, back to Miza, about these archaic laws, shouldn't you think it's time that we transform, and what really needs to be done for it to be transformed? Because we don't see it being prioritized in Parliament. We see other issues being, cropping up in Parliament. They seem to have better things to think about. But do you believe that there is being enough priority given to the reform of, rape law and other laws that relates to discrimination?
I don't think there is sufficient priority being given to all of the law reform that needs to happen, particularly for women's rights. It's amazing that it's something that affects women every day, every minute of the day. And when this program started out, we said we're 51% of the population, and it seems like 51% of the population is ignored on a daily basis. And I know that sounds like very strong terms in which to say it, but I know women's groups that got together and made proposals even to the constitutional reforms process that was happening, throughout, I think, last year, when the public was able to engage with constitutional reform. And there were just simple things being asked, like the language in the Constitution recognized both men and women without saying he, that it be gender neutral language, so that we start from the most basic and the most fundamental law in Sri Lanka to recognize that there are both men and women in this country. So I think that so much needs to change, but priority, as you said, is not being given, and I wonder whether that is so because, and it's something that has plagued me, as why it cannot be prioritized, why men in power, men in parliament cannot see the need for it. Is it really advantaging them so much that the law continues to be the way it is?
Probably we should take away their luxury vehicles and ask them to go by bus and train.
So that they can actually experience
absolutely
what people are going through.
Jayanti, now we spoke a lot about the suffering by masses, by disadvantaged communities in Sri Lanka, migrant workers, etc. But also at the other end of the spectrum are people in power who perpetrate violence. In Hollywood recently, we saw how the Me Too and Time's Up movements sort of really changed the sort of canvas of Hollywood, that accepted culture of sexual harassment was really confronted. In Sri Lanka, we find this at the workplace, we find this in schools, we find this in universities. So, and it is quite a universal problem, really. Only thing is we need to have better protection mechanisms. How do you view this?
I mean, exactly what you just spoke about, the fact that there's violence across the board, whether you're from a rural society, community, or in urban spaces, whether you're the CEO of a company and you're a woman or a man. In that sense, like, it doesn't matter what job, what salary you get, but it doesn't matter which religion you're from, which ethnicity you're from, which race you're from, or which institution you belong to, whether it's religious institutions, media institutions, educational institutions, politicians, you know, the political space. And that is what is patriarchy, right? In terms of it's everywhere, it's insidious, and it just means it's a male-dominated way of being. And this is something that as women's rights activists, as human rights activists, that we try to say that we need to change that. Because those ideas are really ancient and archaic, right? Because, I mean, it happened many, many years ago, this whole ideology of thinking like this. But now we've realized, I mean, you know, the Human Rights Declaration was formed in the 1940s. We are aware that everyone has a right, you know, you're not a right, multiple rights. So in that sense, it's important to really look at what it is and name it. So I think it's important to really understand that we have to call it what it is, and which is why I'll keep saying that is patriarchy. If you look at religious institutions, how many women can be priests, whichever religion it is? And why not? Who decides that? Why is it only a man? Why can't some women actually go to their places of worship when they are menstruating? Again, who made that rule? Definitely not the women. So the men made the rules. So patriarchies were male-dominated, father, rule of the father. So rules made by men for women. Now we don't need that anymore. We are in 2018, right? And thankfully we have a generation of younger people who are questioning this, and I think it's important to keep questioning. Where anything that says, like the ban, alcohol ban, why not? Why can't I go to the supermarket and buy a beer if I want to? I have a right to do that, right? I mean, above 18, I have the same rights as you as a man. So that's all we're saying. We're not saying give women more rights. We're just saying equality in that sense. Yeah.
All right. On that note, we're going for our final break.
Final question, yeah. Belisha, now the World Bank recently raised concerns over low participation of women in the labor force. What are the conditions that prevent women from taking on an active role in the labor force?
I think the fundamental problem is childcare. The entire burden of childcare is generally passed on to the woman, and if you don't have a supportive family system, how are you going to go to work? How can you participate in the labor force? Like, either you have to hire a nanny or put into a daycare system. So Sri Lanka doesn't have a well-functioning daycare system to put a child, but we do have a long maternity leave scheme. So after that, people have very few options to do to go to work. Now only they are kind of promoting these flexible work hours, where we, at least in the Battaramulla, there is that pilot project where you can go to work early and leave work early. But other than that, I don't know any public offices that has this sort of a system, and the private sector also has limited opportunities for working women. Some private companies might have daycare facilities, but majority of the places they do not have. So when women do not have a support system, the only alternative they have is to stay back and take care of children. So that is one of the fundamental reasons for low.
How have other countries dealt with this situation? If we look at regional developing economies, how have they made the environment more conducive for women?
I think first, as I said, they have flexible working hours, and not necessarily to be in office, you can work from home. That sort of infrastructure is available, and I think the institutional framework also supports that. Maybe if you hire a person and they are working from home, maybe there's less tax for the company. There are other benefits the company also might get. So these things have to be promoted and not looked at it in one dimension, but you'll have to look at it in a holistic way, where the working woman will be benefited as well as the employer will be benefited. Then only the employer is motivated to give that sort of flexibility to a woman.
All right, thank you, Charita. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back with the final round of Face the Nation. Stay with us.